So it's a new book and a new year. One of the minor prophets. Minor because the book is short, not because it's unimportant. The book gives us information about Habakkuk, but not very much. All it says is he was a prophet of God. And like other prophets, he receives messages from God and he transmits them to those who will listen. But Habakkuk is different from many of the other prophets because, at least to start off with, he is questioning God, really in a very bold way. There's a dialogue going on between Habakkuk and God, and it's Habakkuk who is driving the debate. With most of the other prophets, God speaks to the prophet, and the prophet might comment or even reply, but rarely will he question. Habakkuk questions what God is doing, and God answers his questioning and his doubts. And Habakkuk is prepared to complain to God. So verses 2 to 4 set out Habakkuk's first complaint. He's got a grievance with God, and he lets it all spill out. Verse 2, Habakkuk has been calling out to God for help for a long time. But God, at least from Habakkuk's perspective, has not been listening. Violence and injustice are all around him, and yet God appears to be doing nothing about it. Why do you tolerate wrong? Says Habakkuk. Habakkuk has been confronted day after day with violence, strife, and conflict. Lawlessness abounds, the law seems unable to make a difference, justice never seems to prevail, people seem to be getting away with it, and the wicked dominate, squeezing out the few who try to get it right. Justice is perverted, says Habakkuk. And Habakkuk just doesn't like living in a world where injustice and violence prevail. Verse 3, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Habakkuk wants this to end. There's only so much that he can take. Basically, he's not a happy prophet. He's perplexed, frustrated. Why do good people suffer? Why do wicked people flourish? What's the point of praying for justice when nothing seems to happen? What kind of God puts up with this wickedness? Why doesn't God intervene? Well, is that you sometimes? Is there something of Habakkuk in you some of the time? Do you get frustrated with the way things are in this country, in the world? Do you wonder why good people suffer? Why God's people in particular suffer violence? Why wicked people often seem to flourish? Well, that's certainly me from time to time, and I'm sure it's most people. We read the newspapers, we watch the news, and every day we hear of some terrible act of violence, some more shocking than others, reported in the news in the last fortnight, as cases went to trial. A 17-year-old murdered three little girls in Stockport. A 20-year-old student murdered a random woman on a beach in Bournemouth to see what it's like to kill somebody. A 12-year-old killed an old man in a park in Leicester. And a 21-year-old murdered a random woman he stalked as she walked her dog in broad daylight. I'm not sure that our society is necessarily any worse or any better than other times in the past, but it's still pretty bad. On the one hand, fewer of us apparently experience serious crime, but violent crime is on the increase, or more people are willing to report violent crimes to the police, much of it domestic. And we hear of perpetrators who are caught, but not everyone is. Not everyone receives justice. When I spoke on this passage almost 20 years ago, there were recent tragic cases of children murdered by their parents. And 20 years on, not much has changed. Only last week we heard how 10-year-old Sarah was taken out of primary school to cover up beatings that she was receiving. And she was killed by her father and stepmother. It might make you despair of the way society is going at the moment. And that's, of course, without mentioning 200,000 abortions each year and the confused and ambivalent attitudes in our society to the value of human life, which has now led to the assisted dying bill, which is going through Parliament. Then there are the wars and conflicts in the world, the barbaric atrocities in Syria, thousands murdered by the Assad regime, the recent car rammings in crowded streets in New Orleans and in Germany. And what about the unjust violence suffered by God's people throughout the world, the persecution, the imprisonments, the killings? Open Doors tells us of a pastor called Barnabas who walks through the camp where he lives. He points out the makeshift tents in every direction. There are hundreds of them, with people huddled inside, seeking refuge from the sun. And these are women, men, and children that he pastors. Thousands of people live there. An informal camp for internally displaced people in Benue State, northern Nigeria. He says that each and every one you are seeing here, we're all Christians. We are displaced because of violence. And Habakkuk expresses the feelings that all of us have from time to time, and he addresses them to God. He dares to question God. Doesn't bottle up his frustrations. He cries out to God, "How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? Don't you care, God? Shouldn't a God of justice see that justice is done? Shouldn't a God of love stop the violence and the strife?" Someone might answer that there will be a day of justice when God will do right in the future. But what of the meantime? Will God do right now? Will God intervene now? Well, God's answer in Habakkuk's day comes in verses 5 to 11. And I suppose the first thing to say about God's answer is that, contrary to what Habakkuk has claimed, God has been listening. God is going to do something utterly amazing in Habakkuk's day. Something unbelievable. Something utterly amazing. God is going to raise up the Babylonians. The Babylonians were the up and coming world power at the time. They destroyed the previous world power, the Assyrians, and these were now to be the dominating power in the region. And God was going to use them, of all people, to punish the sins of Judah, to whom Habakkuk was prophesying. And in the next few verses, God goes on to describe their terrible nature. They're ruthless, impetuous, feared and dreaded, a law to themselves, promoting their own honor. They have horses and cavalry, which move swiftly and violently. Their war machine is likened to leopards and wolves and eagles, and rapid and fierce and terrifying. The blitzkrieg of its day. They take prisoners and overthrow kings and rulers, and nothing can stop them as they sweep past like a violent storm. And finally, in verse 11, God declares they are guilty men whose God is their own strength. So God's answer to Habakkuk's complaint is to send judgment in the form of an invading nation. And judgment had already happened to the northern kingdom at the hand of the Assyrians, and now is to happen to the southern kingdom at the hands of the Babylonians. The Babylonians are not knowingly carrying out God's judgment. They're not answering a call from God. They're lawless, and it's their own strength that guides them. And their God is Marduk. In many ways, they're as guilty as the sinners in Judah. So God's answer to Habakkuk's complaint about lawlessness and injustice is to send greater lawlessness and more injustice at the hands of an evil and terrifying empire. So perhaps not surprisingly, the answer from God raises further questions from Habakkuk. And in verses 12 to 17, we have Habakkuk's rebuttal. There's real incredulity in what Habakkuk says to God in response. God said that Habakkuk would not believe what he had to say, and this is indeed Habakkuk's reaction. In some ways, it's difficult to see exactly what Habakkuk is saying in some of these verses, though the overall thrust is very clear. Verse 12 starts well. Habakkuk expresses his strong belief in the nature of God. God's purposes and ways are rooted in his everlasting nature and his holiness. And these are unchangeable. He's dependable in all his ways. He's the rock. But when Habakkuk says, "You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment," is he expressing confidence in God and acceptance that God has ordained the Babylonians to execute judgment? Or is he expressing incredulity? There's some mistake. You've appointed them to carry out judgment? Them of all people? Verse 13 is clearer, and here there is definitely incredulity. But you are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Surely you cannot allow the wicked to swallow up those more righteous than themselves. There must be some kind of mistake. And to push his point home, he likens the Babylonian actions to those of a fisherman. The people are like helpless fish in the sea. And the fisherman rejoices at his catch and worships the means of his victory, which enables him to live in luxury. And Habakkuk asks God whether this grotesque fisherman, this Babylonian, is going to keep on emptying his net and destroying nations without mercy. How can a holy and a pure God tolerate the wicked executing his judgment? It seems perverse for God to choose a godless nation to bring about judgment, a nation more wicked than Judah. This, of course, begs the question, what, was Judah more righteous than Babylon? Or was Judah worse than Habakkuk perceived it to be? In many ways, Judah had strayed so far from God at this time that they might well be regarded as godless. Were they really more righteous than the Babylonians, as Habakkuk is saying? But to get back to Habakkuk's central point, couldn't a more righteous nation have carried out the judgment? There's no getting around the fact that God is using this godless, evil, immoral nation to carry out his judgment. And God is not behaving in a way that Habakkuk expects or wants. And even for us, this too might be an uncomfortable truth. God seems to be saying that he uses the wicked to execute his judgments, to further his purposes in the world. And like Habakkuk, we might question God in this. Can God have anything to do with evil? Does this mean God is responsible for the men that evil do? Does he direct the evil that they do? Or does he simply allow them to do evil, which suits his purposes? And these are difficult and uncomfortable questions. And to be honest, I'm not sure the answers are that easy either. But what we can say is that God is sovereign. He's in control of events in the world. He doesn't condone evil, though he allows it to take place. At the same time, men are accountable for what they do. They alone are responsible for the wrong they do, and we'll discover some of that in chapter 2. They cannot blame God for the evil they do. Of course, the supreme example of God allowing evil men to carry out his purposes is with his own Son, Jesus Christ. God allowed his Son to be killed though completely innocent. Justice was not done. Peter, on the day of Pentecost, told his listeners, "You, with the help of wicked men, nailed him to a cross." In order to save us, God allowed violence to triumph. The righteous one was swallowed up by the wicked. And as Christians, we are taught to expect to be treated in the same or similar way. God does not promise to intervene in ways we might wish fall. But of course, 3 days later, Christ was raised from the dead and vindicated in the process. After suffering came triumph. God did intervene. And one day, God will intervene in this world in a radical way. There will be a final and supreme justice. Evil will not triumph. A couple of weeks ago, we were looking at Revelation 12, which described the way in which we as believers triumph over Satan through the blood of the Lamb. But we also saw that Satan is not yet finally defeated. He is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. And chapter 13 of Revelation goes on to describe the fury of Satan, represented as an anti-God beast that came out of the sea. Verse 7 of Revelation 13 reads just like God's answer to Habakkuk. If that's the beast, was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword, they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's holy people. And as we shall see, that is where Habakkuk ends up at the end of this book. He will remain faithful. He will patiently endure. Though calamity comes, incredibly, he's able to say at the end of this book, I will rejoice in the Lord. But the point still remains that God does not behave in ways that we fully understand. In a sense, why should we expect to fully understand? God's ways are higher than ours. He is the eternal one. We are not. He knows the end from the beginning. C.S. Lewis, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, tried to express this unpredictability of God when the children first hear about Aslan. Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous meeting a lion. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And sometimes we are tempted to mould God into our own image. We want him somehow to do something he isn't and to do things he doesn't want to do. He's not safe, but he is good. He is sovereign, but he's not capricious. He can allow evil and even use evil, but he is pure and he cannot tolerate wrong. So with that paradox in mind, let's just summarize what we can take away from this passage. Well, firstly, I think this passage tells us that it is okay to question God. Habakkuk asked questions. He didn't just accept things as they were. He wanted to know why God wasn't behaving in the way he expected. His cry was, "How long, O Lord?" And that cry is still the cry of the Christian. In Revelation 6, we read that this is the exact cry of the martyrs in heaven. They cry for justice to be done. And God doesn't expect us to just accept things as they are. He expects us to question him, to even express our doubts. After all, we can't really hide any of that from him anyway. But secondly, God's answers are not always the answers we might want or expect. And certainly coming to terms with God's ways and purposes in this world can be very difficult. God does not only use evil men to his own ends, but he may allow evil men and women to prosper. And like Habakkuk, this might make us question God. And surely the fact that this scripture is here, this book in the Bible, validates that question. And for believers, in some situations, this might mean suffering and even death. It might feel as if justice does not prevail, that evil triumphs. So thirdly, we are called to patient faithfulness and patient endurance. As we look ahead to a new year, 2025, every one of us can be assured that if we have put our faith in Christ, our names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. And we can be assured that there will be ultimate justice on the final day. And that whatever we may face in the coming year, we are all called to faithfulness and to patient endurance, just as was Habakkuk in his day.